Trump slammed Canada with a 50% tariff, accused it of betrayal, and told the world he didn't need their energy, their steel, or their friendship. This isn't some backroom squabble. It's a $750 billion economic bond pushed to the edge by ego, by miscalculation, and by one quiet Canadian response that flipped the entire script. But 10 days later, he was on the phone begging for a deal. Why? Because Canada did the unthinkable. It stood up, hit back without a single shot, and rewired the entire global trade map in silence. Fertilizer, oil, electricity, everything America thought it could bully, suddenly weaponized. And what happened next, inside that White House meeting, no one saw coming. What happens when a G7 ally gets treated like a trade enemy overnight? On March 15, 2025, the White House invoked a 50% tariff on Canadian steel and aluminum, citing national security. After Ontario, Premier Doug Ford suggested cutting electricity exports during a regional interview. According to Bloomberg, over 15 U.S. states depend on Canadian hydroelectric power. Yet the comment, likely rhetorical, triggered one of the fastest retaliatory escalations under Trump's second term. Caroline Leavitt, Trump's press secretary, framed Ford's remark as an egregious threat to American families, despite no action taken. Experts, including Michael Froman, former U.S. trade representative, questioned the legal basis of using Section 232 to justify the tariffs, noting Canada supplies over 25% of U.S. aluminum imports at below-market rates. But the real volatility wasn't the tariff. It was that Trump launched a trade war without notifying Canada's federal government. What looked like a rebuke of a provincial premier quickly snowballed into a full-blown diplomatic rupture. And what came next turned one of America's oldest friendships into a test of economic firepower. During a White House briefing, Caroline Leavitt held up what she called a handy-dandy chart showing Canada's 287% tariff on U.S. butter and 245% on cheese, data pulled from WTO filings. The intent was to frame Canada as a longtime economic aggressor. But trade experts like Chad Bone of the Peterson Institute noted those dairy protections had been in place for decades and were openly discussed during USMCA negotiations. Canada's supply management system was designed to stabilize local farm prices, mirroring the U.S. approach to subsidizing corn and soy, which the Congressional Budget Office reported received $32 billion in federal support. In 2023 alone, the administration omitted these parallels. Instead, Trump's narrative focused on imbalances without addressing cross-border interdependence. According to the U.S. Department of Commerce, over 70% of U.S. car manufacturers use Canadian aluminum in core production, meaning the tariffs would increase production costs by up to 14% within 3 quarters. The irony, America's attempt to punish Canada's trade structure ended up squeezing its own supply chains, and the blowback wasn't limited to dairy. Canada didn't retaliate with tanks. It responded with a televised reckoning. In a nationally broadcast address, Prime Minister Mark Carney declared that the old relationship with the United States is overcalling Trump's tariff policy a strategic betrayal. The Financial Times reported that within 48 hours of the tariff, Ottawa had activated contingency talks with the EU and Japan to expand existing free trade corridors under CETA and CPTPP. Unlike previous disputes, Canada framed the conflict not as a trade disagreement, but as a sovereign standoff. Carney's reference to America wanting our land, our water, our country was symbolic, but also economic. Canada supplies over 90% of U.S. imported hydroelectric power and 72% of its potash-based fertilizer, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration and the International Fertilizer Association. The message was clear. This wasn't about tariffs. It was about leverage. And instead of escalating with counterpunches, Canada weaponized global legitimacy. And what made it most effective, the response wasn't shouted. It was calmly calculated. This wasn't supposed to happen. In previous trade fights, the U.S. held leverage by GDP, by military, by market size. But when Carney said, "We are done being taken for granted," it cut deeper than any tariff. His speech landed not just because of what was said, but who was listening. According to Reuters, leaders in Germany, South Korea, and Australia immediately signaled interest in expanding bilateral trade with Canada in response to the speech. The Canadian dollar which initially dipped on tariff news, recovered 1.7% in 24 hours. A sign market saw Ottawa's posture not as weakness, but resilience. Inside Washington, GOP governors from Michigan and Wisconsin, both swing states, reportedly lobbied Trump's staff to reconsider citing rising costs on U.S.-built vehicles. Even Foxconn, a major U.S. electronics assembler, warned of $200 million in annual losses due to disrupted aluminum sourcing. For the first time, Trump's inner circle saw a soft-spoken nation command the room without raising its voice. And what came next was even more unexpected. Just 10 days after hammering Canada with tariffs, President Trump told reporters that Prime Minister Carney had called to make a deal. But inside sources cited by Politico suggest it was Trump's team who initiated the outreach after Republican lawmakers flagged economic damage to U.S. farmers and manufacturers. Stock market indices dipped 2.1% following the tariff announcement, and Goldman Sachs issued a client alert warning that prolonged disruption with Canada. America's largest trading partner by volume could shave 0.6% off Q2 GDP. Behind the scenes, the pressure to restore talks wasn't diplomatic. It was electoral. The Midwest bloc, vital to Trump's 2024 win, was hit hardest by Canadian counter-tariffs on vehicles and agriculture. According to USDA data, U.S. pork exports to Canada fell 28% year over year by April 2025. Trump's public pivot, telling reporters the U.S. doesn't need to sign deals, was interpreted by Bloomberg as a face-saving maneuver. But behind closed doors, the White House was drafting revised USMCA frameworks. What began as bluster had cornered the president, and now the next move wasn't his alone to make. When Trump floated the idea of Canada being a great deal for the American people, suggesting it received $200 billion in subsidies and free military protection, Carney fired back with a line that froze the room. There are some places that are never for sale. According to Reuters, Carney's team viewed Trump's annexation hit not as hyperbole, but as an extension of his transactional foreign policy Doctrine 1, where sovereignty had a sticker price. Canada's defense budget stood at 1.4% of GDP in 2024, while the U.S. covered 57% of NATO's total spending. But Carney's rebuttal framed this imbalance not as debt, but as a shared legacy of alliance. Trump's framing was instantly met with backlash from Canadian media and opposition leaders who accused the White House of treating Canada like a distressed asset, not a democratic partner. And just when it seemed like the spectacle might spiral, Carney pivoted smiling, thanking Trump for the hospitality, and then without breaking eye contact, restated the phrase, "We're not for sale, ever." It wasn't just a line. It was the end of a negotiation style Canada had stopped entertaining. As Trump publicly dismissed trade talks, calling them overrated, Ottawa quietly accelerated its diversification agenda. According to Bloomberg, Canada increased its non-U.S. export volume by 18.2% year over year as of the first quarter of 2025, with bilateral trade flows to the EU rising 27% under CETA, and a fresh framework with the UK nearing completion. Carney's post-meeting statement made no mention of compromise. It highlighted growth. "Our trade with the U.S. is substantial but not singular," he said. Behind the scenes, Canadian officials were finalizing logistics upgrades at Halifax and Prince Rupert ports to accommodate expanded Asia-Pacific routes, and preliminary talks with India and South Korea were underway. As the Wall Street Journal noted, Canada's share of global lithium exports jumped 42% in just 8 months, a strategic move aimed at reducing U.S. bargaining power over critical minerals. While the U.S. was engaged in parallel trade fights with China, and the EU-Canada sidestepped the chaos and broadened its foundation. The message wasn't shouted, but it was heard worldwide. Canada wasn't pulling away. It was building something stronger elsewhere. Trump treated Canada like a minor lever in a global economic machine, but what he underestimated was the cost of misreading quiet leverage. In 2023, Canada supplied 97% of America's imported potash, 88% of hydroelectric power traded across the northern grid, and more crude oil than any other country, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration. When Carney spoke, world leaders listened not because of military might, but because Canada's restraint illustrated a diplomatic model that contrasted sharply with Trump's headline, "Diplomacy." As reported by the Financial Times, nations like Germany, Australia, and Brazil began recalibrating their long-term trade expectations, with Washington citing the Canada standoff as proof of instability in U.S. economic alignment. It wasn't just about a tariff anymore. It became a global audit of American reliability. While Trump played to a domestic base, with strongman rhetoric, Canada was redefining influence through composure, predictability, and sovereign clarity. And in doing so, it exposed the limits of coercion in a world no longer dominated by unilateral rules. By May 6th, when Carney finally met Trump in the Oval Office, the narrative had reversed. Trump told reporters that Canada wants a deal and that we don't need their cars or their lumber. But U.S. markets dipped 6% that afternoon, and NASDAQ futures slid after his comments, reflecting investor anxiety. Politico later reported that internal memos from the U.S. Trade Representative's office confirmed Canadian negotiators had submitted revised terms, first not Washington. Meanwhile, Goldman Sachs revised its second quarter U.S. GDP projection down from 2.4% to 1.8%, citing tariff-induced volatility with core allies. Trump may have claimed control in public, but the documents showed Canada steered the terms, emphasizing mutual sovereignty tariff protections for key sectors and a non-retaliation clause tied to USMCA's review schedule. Carney refused to re-enter talks without these guarantees, so when they finally sat down in the Oval Office, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Carney slid the revised agreement across the table. Trump didn't speak, facing pressure from Midwestern governors and Wall Street donors. Conceded. The so-called art of the deal had met a quiet counterpunch. Results without bravado. Leverage without noise. He glanced at it, nodded, and signed. Without a handshake. Without a smile. Just silence. The kind that ends a war without a word. We're glad you're enjoying this video. Please like and subscribe. Check out another video that is now on your screen.